every society, and I think you've said this like fairly bluntly. You said you just need 5%, right? Roughly
I don't know what the number is, but it's low.
X
Yes.
number, but a small
Yeah.
number, right? As
Small
you were saying
number.
right now. So maybe it's 1 in 100, maybe it's 1 in 1,000.
Who
But you
knows?
need
Yeah.
just this, what you call, I think, the intellectual elite or the upper tail, different terms for it. But you say it's just a few people that you need to do that. Now, you look at any society today, whether it's a democratically governed society, more authoritarian, you have an education system that's a very, monotonous one, or one that is very creative. You find that at that age, at the age of kids, you find that there's always a few kids who are like that, right? I see that with my nephews, nieces, kids. I see it today also, and I remember it from my time as well. I don't know if you do. So it's always that. It's almost like that's inherently there in any society. That kind of creativity, that kind of crackpotted sort of behavior that sometimes will yield amazing inventions. Question is, what prevents that 5% of kids that I believe exist in every country when the children are young? What prevents them? Is it just the political system? Is it the education system? Is it the values? And if it is a bunch of these forms, then how do you begin to start to change this culture of growth, as you've called it also?
Well,
How do you start to change it? What starts to kickstart that change?
it's hard, because in some ways you need to change the culture, and you need to. I mean, it took Europe hundreds of years to essentially adopt these ideas, which I associate primarily with the 18th century Enlightenment. But even in Europe, there have been major steps backward, not just in Russia, but in Germany, in Italy, and other places like that, in which authoritarian regimes emerged and basically started to take away the freedom to think and force a particular way of thinking about the population. And basically anybody who spoke or wrote against it, took a very significant risk and eventually had to flee. And that's, of course, what happened in these countries. And it's happening in China. I mean, you look at the universities in the United States today, I mean, there are huge numbers of, Asian students and now more and more Russians who are running away from these sort of oppressive authoritarian regime. So what you need, first and foremost, and there I think Adam Smith and his followers are absolutely right. You need something which I think of as sort of pluralism. You need the willingness to allow people to say things that you disagree with, or that go against the main way of thinking. And that turns out to be a major step that many societies were not able to take. Because, one of the things that seems to be hardwired in us, for reasons that I'm not sure about, is the huge respect for the thoughts and knowledge of earlier generations. So we always think about the classic. And then what happens in Europe, to everybody's amazement, and I'm still looking at this 400 years later, and I'm still amazed by this. You start seeing a bunch of people, not a lot, a small percentage of the population, who basically says, wait a minute, this stuff is nonsense. And the people who wrote this, may be good in their own time, but we know much better. And all of a sudden, this whole thing starts falling apart. Aristotle, the great canon, the great writer that everybody thought knew everything. It turns out that they have a whole bunch of writers in the 16th and 17th century who basically say, this guy, is full of it. It's wrong. He said this, he said that. I can prove it's wrong. And then comes Spinoza. Okay, and he said, well, the Bible was written by people, and there are all these internal contradictions. It can't be that this is true and this is also true, because they contradict each other. And so slowly, what you see is this sort of desanctification of the knowledge of the past, and lots of things that you are born with, you have to toss out. Now, that turns out to be very difficult to do. Most societies needed to have some kind of political revolution to overthrow it. So in China, to overthrow the Neo-Confucian consensus, required the revolution of 1912, and you had to get rid of the whole system, and we know what happened. And they within their own time, they were very smart, but they didn't know what we know, and you have to realize that is a hard thing for people to overcome. And the Europeans, for complicated reasons, basically took that step, I would say, between approximately 1450 or 1500 and, say, the death of Isaac Newton in 1727. And by that time, by the end of Newton, it became clear to everybody, hey, we know more than Aristotle and Ptolemy and Galen and all these Hipparchus and Pliny and all these were famous Roman and Greek writers that we've been studying. We're not smart in the sense of being more intelligent. We just know more. And it is that thing that made the Europeans what. And I am not convinced that this kind of freedom to basically abandon what is known by people who taught you and by your parents, and basically say, I can do better, because by inventing something, it's an act of rebellion and it's an act of disrespect. I write a paper in economics that proves that some paper written 20 years ago had it wrong, and I can prove whatever, and that's an act of rebellion. I say, this guy is smart, I'm smarter, I know more. That's not hardwired in us. That has to be culturally infused in us, and not a lot of societies do that.